Hello and welcome to A Novel Idea, the show where we interview authors. My name is Noelle Boc. I am your host, and I am welcoming today J.W. Ocker.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, welcome. Great to have you. So you have a book out called Cult Following, which is a nonfiction. It is not
It's not a novel, right?
Not a novel. Like sometimes we have novels, sometimes we have nonfiction here. So what does set you on the journey of writing a book about cults?
So I do types of books where I pick a topic and then I grab 30 examples of that topic and do essays about it. That's kind of the kind of books I do recently. And this was one of those ideas. Why don't we pick the 30 most interesting cults, write about them, but also write about them in a way that kind of you can draw conclusions about people who join cults and people who lead cults. So that was the format idea. The real idea, though, is I grew up highly religious, super religious. Like first 25, 26 years of my life, I was really in-depth religious, and eventually became not religious. So religion has always fascinated me, like in every kind of form, every format. So looking at cults was a way for me to kind of just step back and kind of analyze myself as well. Because it's really a very human thing, joining a cult.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting as I read through the book that you would point out that there were you're people that you would think were just powerful people, ordinary people who were successful, didn't seem to matter because the driving forces to be in a cult were just very human reasons.
Exactly. I always, if you describe a cult without the word cult, it becomes pretty much what we do as humans, right? You join together with like-minded people who you care for, under a common cause, under a charismatic leader, and that's what a cult is. And that's what also society is, and businesses are, and families are, and friendship circles are. They're all the same thing. So it's just another, we use the word cult as a pejorative because oftentimes these certain groups can end awry, right? In abuses or in deaths that could be prevented or those kinds of things. So a lot of times the word cult just means this group ended badly. whereas if you take away the bad part, it was just a group, right? And there are cults, quote unquote, cults out there that were benign. They weren't, they weren't abuses. And again, usually those abuses are just, they're not a element of the group. They're an element of the leader, the authoritarian, the person who's given too much power. Power corrupts. And that's true again in politics and business and families. Right. The person given too much power can often corrupt and be abusive. But the group itself, they're just a group of people working together, being together, or just experiencing life together. So that's kind of why I always say it's kind of the most human thing you can do is join a cult, as opposed to what we usually think of it as people are weird if they join a cult, or they're gullible, or there's something wrong with them. That's kind of usually the cliche. And you always hear people say when they watch a documentary on Netflix, or there's a million cult documentaries out there, and they say, as they're watching, they're like, am I gullible enough to join a cult, right? Am I the kind of person that would join a cult? And I always say, that's the wrong question. That's like a straw man question. The real question is, if at your lowest, whether that low comes through health or society or existentially or whatever reasons, financially, will you accept help? And if the answer to that is yes, then yes, you could join a cult. It's kind of the way it goes. Because again, it's just human. Every cult I look through, even the most weirdest cults out there, worshiping feet and aliens and stuff, it's still the same basic human impulses involved. And it just couldn't be more human.
Right, yeah. And as you're saying, if you think about it in that kind of terms, then any group that you join, right, you could start terming as a cult in some way, right? Exactly.
And in fact, the word cult is kind of falling out of favor with academics, at least, because it's a pejorative, right? And they want to look at these groups more objectively than that. Immediately, if you put a cult label on something, you've kind of tainted the experiment.
Right.
So what they've started calling them is emerging religions or new religions, which is very interesting because people in religions, mainstream religions, don't like that definition, right? They don't like to think of themselves as being a successful cult. That's kind of how I define a cult as a non-successful religion. The inverse is true. A religion is definitely a successful cult. At some point in time, all the most mainstream religions, no matter how big, no matter how many members they have, started out as a small group of people that believed something different than the norm. And that's, and succeeded. Got through all the hurdles of power-hungry, abusive leaders, or societal disdain. Or they got through all those things and grew and prospered and became so mainstream that we don't even think of them as weird anymore.
Right.
Even though they are.
Even though, yes. If you start picking anything apart.
Exactly.
And that's interesting too, right? To have academics going towards saying, oh, it's an emerging religion or a new religion, when you have like some of those that you detail in there weren't really about a deity of some kind that they were worshiping or anything like that. It's just like, well, I believe that aliens are going to come and rescue us at some point from destruction, or something like that. That doesn't, I wouldn't say that was a religion. I would just say, like, you're just in a group of people who believe this certain thing.
That's a great point. It goes even further, right? There's diet cults in the book. There is, self-help cults in the group. There's corporate cults in the group. So you're right. You don't have to, even though we think of this as a religious kind of definition cult, it really is just a group of people that believe or want to believe the exact same thing. And there might be no deity, no spiritualism, no, baggage from previous religions in that. It's just, people wanting to be thin in the case of a diet cult, right?
Right,
So it's that kind of, again, which is super, almost more human, right? Once you take out all the really kind of high-level grand ideas of deity and immortality and future and just boil it down to like a basic, I, want to feel good about myself. It puts, again, cults in another interesting light that kind of illuminates what they really are.
Right, yeah, and I was also very interested in, which we see in some modern day, or right now, things like QAnon is a good example, right, where it's all about you doing your own research, but you're achieving levels of knowledge, right, so you're going up these levels, right, that you're able to, and then, so you feel good about yourself because, I'm part of this group, I'm special, I know these certain things that other people don't know. If they only did this, they'd understand. And I'm like, oh, that's, that follows a lot of the rules of a cult.
It does, and we actually, that's funny you mentioned that, we actually toyed with including QAnon in the book, because, again, we wanted to kind of explode a little bit of what people think of a cult is, and kind of expand that. But the problem is, cult is still a pejorative, so we had to be careful who we put that label on for libel reasons.
Right.
So we couldn't just be like, it couldn't, even though in our minds it was like an academic exercise of, okay, if a cult is these things, these criteria outside of spirituality or whatever, could this be a cult? Could this be a cult? Could this be a cult?
Right.
So QAnon was like obviously top of, just because of the news, top of our mindset, but then the lawyers came in like, maybe you shouldn't do that. I'm like, yeah, you're right. Then reality came in and practicality. I'm like, okay, good call.
Right, and to say like, is it not, like, and I thought that was interesting towards the end, because you talked about one of the cults that was a completely online thing. There was not a physical group that ever got together, but just people getting together in a space, whether it's a real space or a virtual space.
I love that cult because just idea-wise, we always thought of the internet as the great educator, right? You could one of the ways bad cults succeed is by cutting people off from information, from their families, from their friends, geographically, from TVs, from news, because they want them in that fishbowl where they control all information, so they don't know what's true and they aren't wrestling with ideas and don't have other perspectives in there. And you think, the internet could solve all that. If you hear a weird idea or an idea that seems fantastical, you just go Google, right, and figure out, okay, no, that's not true, this is true. And also, you're not trapped, right? As long as you have access to the internet, you can reach out to people. You're not sequestered. And yet, and we've learned this, I guess, in society, the internet doesn't do that. It's not the great emancipator of knowledge. It does the opposite. It actually, isolates us in small communities, just like cults do, where we only get one perspective and every other perspective is bounced out and you're just isolated. So again, even though technically, we always think about cults as you're almost like chained in the basement kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
With an internet cult, an online cult, you just log off and you should be free, but we're learning that that's not true at all. You're as trapped as if you were chained in the basement.
Right, yeah, it's fascinating when you start looking at that.
Terrifying and
way.
Scary and fascinating.
Yes. So you have 30 cults in this book.
I do.
So what would you say would be one of the ones you'd pick as one of the weirdest?
I always go with the Koreshan unity, the Koreshans. And this isn't David Koresh. This isn't the Waco cult. They just happen to name themselves the same. This is a 19th century cult that settled in Estero, Florida. They were run by a man named Cyrus Teed, who would eventually call himself Koresh. And it was one of the good cults, like no abuses that we know of, no abuses, no extremely violent traditions or rituals. They're actually really progressive. The ruling board was all women. It was a board of 7 women. So they're very progressive. And then this is the 19th century, so that was like not an unheard of thing, right? Their compound in Estero was completely had lights and electricity. Thomas Edison actually came down to check out their setup because they were such pioneers in using electricity. They set up schools and allowed anybody to come to the schools. So again, the opposite of a fishbowl. They're like, no, if you have children and they don't have schools in your area, send them to ours, it's fine. They set up an arts program, they had a theater in this commune. But the weird thing about them is their main tenet. And I always say that, like, if you are a cult, if you're starting a cult, if you're in a cult, usually that means you're new, right? You don't have like thousands of years of history like some of the mainstream religions. So if you're new, you have to have a reason for being new. You have to have some new revelation that nobody's ever heard of, and most cults don't. They usually, it's a mishmash of like Hinduism and Christianity and all the major religions. They just kind of pick what they want and create a dogma that's not that new. But the Koreshans had a really new dogma. They were a hollow earth cult, which by itself isn't new because there's lots of hollow earth cults. Even Christianity is kind of a hollow earth cult if they believe in hell in the center of the world, right? But in this case, they believe that we are actually right now, me and you right now, are actually in the center of the earth. That it's not hollow beneath our feet. We're literally inside an enclosed sphere right now, which if true, right, changes everything you know, right? Suddenly you look at the sky different, you look at the world different. They believed it was the sphere was about 8,000 miles across, so very small. All the spatial stuff you see, the sun, the moon, the stars, just optical illusions. And that outside of that shell was nothing, void. There's nothing, no existence at all, kind of like pre-Big Bang, right? No existence at all. And they believed this because they thought that a creator, because they were very Christianity influenced, that a creator wouldn't make a finite creation like us and then put us in an infinite world, a universe. It just didn't make sense to them. They thought that God would want us to know the world. And for us to know the world, it had to be pretty finite because we're small brain creatures. So they literally spent their time just measuring the Earth, trying to prove it was concave. You know, that we were all walking around this inner surface. So I love that, and I love it also because I'm a very experiential writer. I have to do some traveling. I have to involve myself. Their communes still exist to this day in Estero. They're all gone, but the commune's there in a park. So you can go see their buildings, their amphitheaters. You can go see the grave of the last Koreshan. All right there, and you can go kind of get a feeling of what it was like to live on that compound in the 1800s. So that's my favorite cult, again, because I can call it a favorite cult because there's no abuses or anything icky in there.
Yeah.
But also that idea, again, I want that idea of blow my mind. Even if you're wrong, even if what you believe is not true. And this was before, obviously, you know, the Wright brothers and before, you know, Neil Armstrong. Just at least still come up with something new that blows my mind. And then I might think that you have a pipeline to a deity or advanced intelligence, you know? If you're just telling me things I kind of could figure out myself, like be good to each other and protect your world, I'm like, I don't, you could come up with that yourself. You know, you don't need like advanced intelligence for that.
For sure, yeah. What do you think's the worst cult that's in your book?
That's the Anthill Kids. This is, believe it or not, a Canadian cult. And I don't know if it's the worst to me because, you know, I was used to, you know, Jim Jones's group, how they ended, right? It's kind of, we all know how the People's Temple ended, right? We all know how Heaven's Gate ended. We all know how Koresh and Waco ended, and those are all horrible, horrible situations. So maybe I was immune to that, but the Anthill Kids were individually very vicious, or the leader was. And again, Canadian group, started out as like kind of a healthy living, vegetarian, stop smoking kind of group. And then this guy got so power hungry that he just started doing all kinds of really sick abuses to his followers, you know? He would do what he'd call surgeries, where he would just, he wasn't a doctor, had no medical, and just cut them open and do stuff and like desecrate their corpses and kill their children. It was, you know, like scale-wise, the deaths weren't as big as, say, Jonestown, but just the individual, like, personal ugliness of it, and the fact that he didn't really lose followers because of those things. Right. In fact, what one of his wives, because again, usually if it's a male leader of a cult, he's going to take all the wives. She actually said, yes, he did horrible things when he was drunk or doing surgeries, but other than that, he was a pretty good guy, right? Which is, you know, typical abusive relationship kind of rationalization. And this was a woman that he stapled her arm to a table, and then till it turned purple, then cut it off himself, and like would burn her and do all he did, pull her teeth out, horrible things to her, but she still found a way to see him as a decent guy, right? which again, pretty common. I mean, that's an extreme version of it, but it's pretty common.
Common abuse.
Yeah, exactly.
Relationship.
So that's the again. I don't know why that one was the one we did first, right? So because my usual topics are more lighthearted than that, and my tone is very naturalistic and jokey, which is one of the reasons why we want to tackle a little bit serious subject matter. To prove to the publisher that I could do this, right? I had to find the worst cult and write an entertaining article about them. So that was the one we chose, was the Anthill Kids.
Yeah. There's some horrible things in there.
Yes, that's the thing. This is not, even though like there are people like the Koreshans who are like benign, most cults, and this is why cults have that kind of negative cast to the name, they end up in extremely abusive situations. Some of the worst things you can do to a person, you can do it inside of a cult. So
yeah. So I was just in Japan this last week. So interestingly, I was on a tour, and the tour guide was just talking about all sorts of things, and he brought up, he's like, oh, you've noticed how clean Japan is? It's like, oh, it's so always so clean, and everybody, no one has. So he's like, oh, I'll have a trash bag on the bus because there's no place. They don't have public trash barrels anywhere in Japan, right? Like you're looking at them, there's nowhere. And so he mentioned, and I was like excited when I read your book because I was like, so he mentioned that the sarin gas attack that happened in Japan. He didn't mention the cult. He didn't say like, oh, there's a cult responsible, but he was just like, oh, one of the reasons there are no trash barrels in Japan is because they were using them in these attacks, and they wanted to get rid of any ability for someone to do that again in the future, and that's why. And I was like, and then I heard that, and then I read your entry like after, and I was like, oh, look at this. This is like actually completely lines up to what I just learned about.
They were an interesting cult because again, there's a lot of doomsday cults, but they were one of the few that just got tired of just predicting it and tried to bring it about with mass attacks, and like they would try to figure out that hire scientists and create gases to like kill important people, and on the subway they actually did kill people. Fortunately, they were a bit inept at making that gases. It takes a lot of knowledge and a lot of like stuff to make weapons of mass destruction and toxins, and they were mostly failed at it, but they didn't fail. Actually, they killed a lot of people, but it could have been way worse had they not like kind of messed up the entire process. But again, what I tried to do with those 30 cults. So I actually had, my original list was close to 100 cults.
Oh wow!
And if you look at the stats, there's uncounted number of cults. There's like tens of thousands of cults all over the world. And what I learned though, and my original set had 60. What I learned though is they're pretty repetitive after a while. Believe it or not, right? Even though
I could believe it.
Yeah. Well, right. This is a strange thing to say, but if you've seen one UFO cult, you kind of seen them all. They all believe the kind of the same things, roughly the same ideas, roughly the same end goals. Doomsday cults, whether your doomsday is, nuclear war, the return of Christ, or whatever your doomsday is, kind of all the same. So we were able to kind of boil it down. These 30 cults are chosen because they're kind of iconic of all the cults, but also there's usually some interesting like twist in these 30 that made them stand out more than others. But yeah, the repetition was kind of surprising to me. I thought it'd be so hard to like choose the ones I'd want in the book, but it turned out to be pretty easy, honestly. Like that's interesting. Oh, that's just another person that believes UFOs are going to save us from destroying our own planet, knock them off the list, So yeah, that's kind of how we got those 30.
Interesting too. That cult from Japan, I was putting them in one of my lists as like one of the worst, because of because that to me was a surprising piece, was that they were trying to actually bring about the things themselves, as opposed to like, all right, within the cult we're controlling things and killing off people and whatever, but like they took it outside.
Yeah, so they became a cult and a terrorist organization.
Yeah,
those two things. Most cults aren't terrorist organizations. Officially.
Yeah, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. That's right. And it was just like that perfect thing that I just came back from Japan and heard about something, and then read about it like, oh. The other one, that was like my personal brushes with cults, I guess. And when I was much younger, but I remember walking into stores that were all about Dianetics. Like you go into like a bookstore or something, and I didn't know what it was, and you're walking in and they're trying to like, sell you the book, and like, and I was kind of, what the hell? You walk away. It's like, okay, that's weird. But just very interesting like that. It was like, oh, like here's where that was coming from. So it was nice to like see some of those background pieces that I never really, I guess, learned, but just remembered the existing
Scientology is interesting to me. Like, I did my undergrad in Clearwater. And Clearwater is where they're headquartered. Like, they own most of downtown. You walk downtown and they're just in phalanxes of, like, uniforms and stuff. And it's a very, Tom Cruise has a mansion down there, that kind of thing, right? But here's the thing. They were one of the. So I always joke that, like, when I do nonfiction, like, every single line I write, because it's very experiential. I interview people. I go do places. I share my opinions. Every single line is libelous, potentially libelous, right?
Right.
So every time I write a book, the publisher has the lawyers come out and they start, looking at it and say, okay, is this true? Do you have proof of this? Did this person actually say this? Do you have proof of this? To make sure, we're not on grounds for libel. And in this case, for this one book, out of all my nonfiction books, the lawyers came first.
Oh.
And they looked at our TOC, our table of contents, and they were like, like I said, QAnon, they're like, you probably shouldn't apply that label to them. Scientology was one we put in there at first, and they're like, don't do that. And mostly with that reason is because they are very litigious. They're very much protective of their reputation to extreme degrees. But the irony is I kind of, started writing about cults and kind of forming my own ideas about what a cult is and stuff. And I started kind of realizing that Scientology might fit my definition of religion these days more than my definition of cults, because one of my definitions of mainstream religion is it's too big to fail, right? So you have a controversy in the Catholic Church. That doesn't bring down the whole Catholic Church.
Right.
They're spread around, the authorities spread, they can isolate that kind of badness and say, nope, this isn't us, this is a bad part of it, we'll get rid of it, we'll do what we need to do. Same with, like, evangelical Christianity. How many, like, TV preachers have just gone down in flames, right, for being hypocrites and criminals and stuff. But keeps on, right? They're too big to fail. And Scientology has weathered multiple controversies, right? And not just like these days, it's all the celebrity whistleblowers that come out, right?
Right.
But they started out in controversy. So they originally started out, with L. Ron Hubbard and his Dianetics book and everything, on a ship. They were a ship-based religion or cult. When they finally got a land base, which was in Clearwater, it's this hotel downtown Clearwater. I think it's where the Stones wrote "Can't Get No Satisfaction," but they bought this hotel. It's Flagland Base, what it's called now, and they immediately started plans to take over Clearwater, like very nefarious plans, like bad stuff, right? So bad enough that the FBI raided them, and immediately just kind of like they got penalized. I don't think there was any jail time, but there was penalties and all these kinds of things, and they weathered it. They didn't go down in flames like most cults would have. In fact, they were successful in taking over Clearwater. They just changed their strategy to legal ones. So now they just bought up real estate as fast as they could, and now they've kind of owned Clearwater in a legal way. But again, they haven't fallen despite controversy. Is kind of one of my definitions. So they continue to do that in 100 years, 200 years. If they figure out how to, like, hand off power in a way that doesn't center on one person, they could be a larger mainstream religion and relatively easy.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah, right?
Troubling and fascinating.
And that's why one of the reasons why cults go down is because the leader loves the power so much that they don't make a succession plan. And honestly, most cults, one of the tenets almost every single cult has is immortality on this planet. Like, if you join us, you will be immortal. So they really have no reason to make a succession plan if they're going to be around for the rest of eternity. Right?
Of course. I'm going to live forever.
Yep, and that's when a lot of cults go down, is when that leader who's preaching immortality dies. It's kind of hard to get around that.
I was interested with how many that did actually successfully manage to continue, at least for a while, after the death of the main leader. And I was I'm like, oh, it's still going.
That's some of that is cognitive dissonance, which is, if you read the book, that term cognitive dissonance, which we use all the time in layman talk, came out of a study of cults. It was a UFO cult that, a researcher in Minnesota was able to watch in real time. They set a date for the end times when the UFOs were coming. And he's like, oh, great, I can actually be there for the day after when the UFOs don't come, when their entire religion is proved false, right? I can see what happens. And what he learned was, what happens is you rationalize it. So you can hold two truths. One, we said the aliens were coming, and that's the proof of our truth. Two, the aliens didn't come, but we're still true. Like, those two, like, warring ideas can be in the same head, right? And that's that cognitive dissonance. So that, part of that is if our leader preached immortality and then died right in front of us, you'd think that's enough evidence to be, okay, this whole thing was wrong, but you can't. It's so hard for us to be wrong as people. Like, we can't, especially if we set our whole lives around it. It's very destroying to ourselves to admit that we were wrong about something big. So our cognitive dissonance kicks in, and we're like, no, I can merge that into a slightly different theology and show that one was true enough. That kind
Say,
of
oh no, his soul and
Yeah.
send it into immortality.
That's right. They
and
redefine what
right,
death is.
yes.
They do that a lot. Yeah.
Right, and then no, it's okay.
But even I think Christians did that back in the early days when Christ came back and like was preaching like I'll prepare a place for you. Most Christians thought he meant right away, like that week, that month, that year. And when he didn't, they kind of changed theology, and now we are 2,000 years later, still hasn't returned, but that's fine. That fits into how their theology has changed over the years.
So fascinating. It is really fascinating. I keep using that word, but like it
is. Yeah.
I thought there were just so many interesting things about this book that I was like, oh, like really this one. And then a lot of cults I've never heard of.
Yes.
And then so many that I had, or ones that I guess I knew something about, but not a lot about. So it was nice to like get the bigger picture, of the whole.
Yeah,
the whole
and that was part of my biggest challenge with this book was there's a couple cults that had to go in there. Like it was kind of part of the deal. One of them was, of course, People's Temple with Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate, and the other one was the Manson family. And I'm just like, man, I got to write a 2,000-word essay about these book-length topics. There's entire books written about those cults, right?
Right.
And they're multiple books, right? And I got to boil it down to the essence and make it interesting and powerful in 2,000 words. That was the hardest part. For those bigger cults, for the more obscure ones, a lot more freedom to like write those essays. But for the bigger ones, how do I make the Manson family interesting in this book? When you can just go read Helter Skelter yourself and be like appalled and fascinated and all those things.
Now, are you working on something right now?
Always. So I have a book. So I also write fiction. So my next fiction comes out in August, but my next nonfiction comes out in January.
Oh.
It's called Don't Go There. And it's a collection of, again, 30 places across the world that have some crossroads of strangeness about them. So it's not just like a haunted house or like a building or anything like that. It's like the Bermuda Triangle, the Suicide Forest in Japan, big places that have multiple mysteries that overlap and become these like weird centers of obsession by humanity. So,
and there's at least 30 of those.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And again, some of them you'll heard of. You heard like Bermuda Triangle. Everybody's heard of that. It's the granddaddy of those places. And then there's a lot of there that nobody's ever heard of that are very obscure, but still just as fascinating if given the attention.
All right, I'm going to look forward to that. Now, I always ask everybody, do you have a library card?
I think I let mine expire, but I do usually. I got 3 daughters, so of course we use the library. In fact, I have. I live in one town in New Hampshire, Nashua, so we have our local library. But I also have a membership usually to the library next door in Hollis, so we have 2 libraries.
Ah, well, okay, that's okay then. Since I'm the library director down the street.
No, super important. Even as a writer, super important. Like when people check out the books from libraries, it's so helpful, and like I'm super pro library.
Yeah. Good. Everyone should be.
Everyone should be, yep.
Everyone should be. Well, we have come to the end of our times here, but thank you so much for coming. This was a great topic. If anybody out there is looking for something really interesting to read, I definitely am going to recommend Cult Following. So thank you again for coming, and thank you everyone out there for watching, and please tune in for more episodes. Bye, everyone.